The day Grace Holloway turned 28, she buried her mother and inherited nothing, not the ancestral house on Somerwell Hill, not the art gallery that bore her family's name, not even the pearl necklace that had been passed down through 5 generations of Holloway women. Everything, every acre, every account, every precious memory had been signed over to her cousin, Margot, a cousin who had never spent a day helping Grace care for her mother through dementia, a cousin who had never worked a single shift in the gallery or dusted a single canvas, a cousin who hadn't even shown up at the funeral. Grace sat in the echoing cold of the solicitor's office, her mother's will laid out before her like a slap in the face. The old lawyer, too polite to look her in the eyes, simply cleared his throat and said, "It appears your mother made her intentions clear some months before her passing." But Grace knew better. Her mother had begun slipping into confusion a year ago. Names, dates, sometimes even Grace's face. She wouldn't have rewritten a will, not without guidance, not without someone pushing the pen, and that someone was Margot, perfect, polished Margot, who had lived in New York for years, visiting only when the family name needed public polishing. Grace had seen the way her mother changed when Margot came around, how the fog would briefly lift in favor of old admiration, how the pride returned to her voice when she said, "You should be more like Margot." Grace had forgiven her mother for that. She blamed the illness, but she would never forgive Margot for stealing what wasn't hers. The Holloway estate wasn't just property, it was history, a legacy built by strong women curators, painters, writers stretching back to the early 1900s. Grace's great-grandmother had hosted intellectual salons there. Her grandmother had preserved its historic walls through 2 recessions. Her mother had turned the gallery into a thriving cultural hub. And Grace, for all her invisible labor, had kept it from falling apart these past 5 years, until Margot took it and walked away like Grace had never existed. So Grace packed a suitcase, left her tiny 1-bedroom flat, and returned to Somerwell Hill, not to reclaim what was stolen, but to dismantle what had been corrupted. The estate was locked when she arrived. No surprise. Margot had changed the codes, but Grace still had the skeleton key and old brass one her mother once wore on a ribbon around her neck. The door creaked open like it was sighing at her return. The house was different. New furniture, cold lighting, paintings removed or replaced with modern knockoffs. The warmth had been stripped away and replaced with magazine aesthetics. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a stranger pretending. Grace walked the halls like a ghost. Each room held a memory: her mother brushing her hair on the velvet sofa, her father sketching blueprints by the window before he vanished into scandal. The Holloways had never been a perfect family, but they had been real. Margot's version was curated, sterile, fake. In the old library, Grace found the first clue, a paper shredder, still plugged in, with curled strips of legal documents in its bin. She stayed up until a.m. reconstructing them, and what she found made her blood freeze. A revocation notice. Her mother's original will, dated 5 years prior, named Grace the sole heir of the house and gallery. A second document showed a power of attorney granted to Margot during the months when her mother's memory had begun to erode. The signature was familiar, but wrong, too clean, too steady. Grace had boxes of letters, notes, recipes, evidence of her mother's declining handwriting. The new signature was a lie. Margot hadn't just convinced her mother to change the will, she had forged it. Grace didn't rush. Revenge, she'd learned, was like restoring a painting: slow, meticulous, deliberate. You don't tear it down. You peel it back layer by layer until the truth bleeds through. So she stayed. Margot, predictably, wasn't home. She was busy gallivanting across Europe, curating exhibitions and basking in interviews where she called the Holloway estate her childhood sanctuary and the gallery her greatest responsibility. Her absence gave Grace space to move, to dig, to quietly untangle what her cousin had spun. She started with the gallery's digital archives. Her mother had been old-fashioned, but Grace had digitized every contract, every acquisition, every donation receipt. Passwords hadn't changed. Margot had been careless. It didn't take long to find discrepancies, art pieces listed as sold, but never reported. Restoration funds moved into private accounts. Grace traced transfers to shell companies, one in Luxembourg, another in Cyprus. Margot was draining the gallery from the inside. Then came the real estate documents. The estate was collateral. Margot had taken out a renovation loan against the house. Over £1.2 million. Only a fraction had been spent. The rest had vanished into private accounts with vague names like Wellpoint Strategies and June Holdings. Grace printed everything. Her plan didn't require scandal. It required precision. She called an old friend, Lena Travers, now a top-tier solicitor who had once interned at the gallery. Lena owed her a favor. When Grace explained what she had, Lena's voice sharpened. She could go to prison for this. Grace shook her head. I don't want her in prison. I want her to watch everything she stole burn. Slowly, Lena agreed to help on one condition: full documentation. So Grace spent the next week rebuilding her mother's signature timeline. She cross-referenced bank withdrawals with doctor visits, matched the date of the new will with care facility logs that clearly marked her mother as mentally disoriented, memory fragmented, unfit for legal discussion. Then she found the linchpin: a voice recording from a call between Margot and the family's longtime financial advisor, accidentally saved to the estate's cloud backup system. In it, Margot said, "She thinks I'm you half the time, Grace. She barely remembers her own name. If I don't take control, we'll lose everything." The advisor replied, "You need legal backing," to which Margot replied, with laughter in her voice, "Don't worry. I've got her signature on paper already. She won't know the difference." Grace played the file twice. Not out of disbelief, but out of rage. That laugh, so easy, so smug, crackled in her ear like static. The voice of someone who had never paid a price in her life. But now, Grace was the invoice. When Margot finally returned, the house looked just as she left it. That was intentional. Grace didn't want confrontation yet. She wanted a front-row seat to the unraveling. Margot entered the estate like a queen. Designer luggage, a flowing silk coat, talking on the phone to someone about an upcoming Venetian collection. She didn't even notice Grace at first. When she did, her expression barely flickered. "I wasn't aware squatters were allowed in the manor," she said. Grace smiled coolly. "Family's always welcome, right?" Margot rolled her eyes. "I hope you're not still sulking about the will." "You're so sentimental, Grace. That's why you never succeeded." "No," Grace said softly. "I didn't succeed because I was too busy keeping our mother alive while you were busy playing heiress in Milan." Margot didn't respond. She didn't need to. Guilt was never part of her emotional vocabulary. Grace let it go. She would have her answer soon enough. 2 weeks later, a quiet summons landed in Margot's inbox, a formal challenge to the will, filed with the High Court, accompanied by full medical documentation, an affidavit from Dr. Ramsey, the neurologist who treated their mother, and a signed confession from the notary who had witnessed the new will. The man admitted that Margot presented a signature already affixed and paid him in cash. And then came the press leak. Lena handled it. Within 48 hours, the story ran on 3 major platforms. Gallery heiress accused of forging will, defrauding estate. Whistleblower cousin claims cultural property theft at historic Somerwell House. Grace didn't go public. She didn't need to. The narrative shaped itself. Investors pulled out. The gallery's biggest donor, the Aldrich Foundation, froze its partnership. An anonymous audit began on all property Margot had touched. She was asked to voluntarily step down from her director role. Margot's silence grew louder with each passing day. Grace stayed at the estate, listening, watching, letting her cousin stew in the storm. Then came the call. Margot's voice was tight, brittle. "How could you do this to me?" Grace answered plainly. "You did this to yourself. She was my aunt. She was my mother. You can't prove anything in court." "I don't need to," Grace said. "You'll settle. Because if you don't, this house becomes a crime scene. And the gallery? It'll never recover." The line went dead. But Grace knew the terms had been accepted. Margot's settlement came not with an apology, but with a single-page statement issued through her legal team. Due to unforeseen legal conflicts, Margot Holloway will withdraw from the Holloway estate and its associated ventures, effective immediately. All rights to the Somerwell Hill property and Holloway Gallery will transfer to Grace Holloway as per revised agreements. There was no admittance of guilt, but Grace didn't need an apology. She had the keys, the court verified. Reversal granted her not just the estate and gallery, but retroactive control over financial decisions made in the past 6 months. That meant every shady withdrawal, every consulting fee, every false loan Margot had buried in shell accounts. Grace now had full visibility and legal claim to pursue reimbursement, but she didn't press charges, not because she forgave Margot, but because ruin was more satisfying than prison. Margot's reputation disintegrated overnight. Galleries rescinded invitations. Her apartment lease in London was quietly terminated by her landlord to avoid negative press. The European art circles she once charmed closed their doors in silence. She didn't go to prison. She went invisible. Exactly where Grace wanted her. But the story wasn't over. Because the Holloway legacy, everything her ancestors had built, was in pieces. The gallery's name had been dragged through months of scandal. Public trust was gone. Longtime staff had either left or been displaced by Margot's contractors. The house, too, was in disrepair beneath its modern veneer, cracked pipes, mold beneath designer wallpaper, even foundational issues in the West Wing. Grace spent the next 6 months rebuilding not just the walls, but the soul of Somerwell Hill. She rehired former curators, brought back local artists, opened the gallery to student exhibits and community programs. She created an entire wing dedicated to Holloway women, portraits, journals, restored letters. Her mother's section included voice recordings from the early days of the gallery, when she had given interviews about turning grief into purpose. After Grace's father disappeared, visitors began returning, slowly, hesitantly. But they came, and something changed. People no longer whispered about scandal or theft. They talked about resilience. They praised Grace's quiet strength, her refusal to capitalize on drama, her dedication to restoration. Her revenge had been surgical. And now, her reward was blooming. One evening, while cataloging a collection of unsorted family heirlooms from the attic, Grace found an envelope unmarked, yellowed at the edges, tucked inside a cracked jewelry box. Inside was a letter, handwritten in her mother's looping cursive. "My dearest Grace, I know the world has asked you to be small, to shrink so that others might feel taller. Even I did, without meaning to. I compared you. I pushed you aside. Not because I didn't see your strength, but because it frightened me. You were always so steady, so observant. The truth is, I was scared of losing you the way I lost myself. If Margot ever hurts you, know that I knew she would try. That's why I kept the old will. It's hidden inside the backing of the sunflower painting, the one we hung in the library. You always loved that one. This house belongs to you, not because of blood, but because you never ran from its weight. You carried me, even when I forgot who you were. I remember now, and I love you." Mom Grace folded the letter carefully, her hands trembling. She hadn't found the painting yet. It had been replaced by one of Margot's flashy, soulless pieces. But she knew where to look now. The next day, she uncovered the old sunflower painting in the cellar, its frame chipped but intact. She sliced the back open. There it was, the original will. Signed, witnessed, clear. More than any legal ruling, this was truth etched in ink by her mother's own hand. Grace didn't tell the press. She didn't need validation. She hung the painting in the center of the gallery's west wall, with a single plaque below it, for the ones who remember. As the year turned, Somerwell Hill thrived. Tour groups returned. The gallery held its first Holloway Women's Retrospective since Grace was a child. She stood at the opening ceremony, dressed in her mother's old velvet coat, speaking not as the girl who had once lived in someone else's shadow, but as the woman who now owned the light. She didn't mention Margot once, but everyone knew what had happened, and who had emerged from the ashes. Tiles, dusting the estate in soft white silence. Grace stood by the tall window in the upstairs drawing room, watching the groundskeeper's string lights. along the Iron Gate preparing for the Holloway Gallery's first Winter Light exhibition in nearly a decade. She sipped tea from her mother's favorite porcelain cup. It had taken a year to restore everything Margot had broken. The gallery now ran as a foundation, not just a business funded by donations, heritage grants, and a portion of Grace's own inheritance. The estate served as both museum and retreat, hosting artists, writers, and scholars who needed time to breathe and rebuild, just as Grace once had. And this time, she hadn't done it alone. Old staff had returned, all of the archivist, Mr. Rowe, the groundskeeper, even Mrs. Delaney, who used to teach Sunday art classes in the garden. Together, they stitched the soul of Summerwell back into its bones. But Grace wasn't trying to recapture the past. She was rewriting it, one truth at a time. She received a letter from Margot in December. Handwritten. The envelope bore no return address. Inside, a folded sheet of cream paper. The handwriting, sharp and slightly slanted. You won. I suppose you always would have. They just never let me believe it. I don't expect forgiveness. And I don't want it. But I wanted you to know. I've left everything behind. The names, the money, the stage. I can't play that part anymore. I hope, someday, when they walk these halls, they remember you, not me. Grace folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer with her mother's single quotes no anger, no satisfaction. Just quiet closure. Margot was gone. Not destroyed. Just erased. Like a painting overpainted too many times until all that remained was shadow and silence, and Grace had no need to hang her portrait in the House of Memory. On New Year's Eve, Summerwell Hill opened its doors to over 100 guests for the first time since the estate had been nearly sold off. Guests wandered through galleries bathed in soft golden light. Children played in the conservatory, where Grace had once sat quietly sketching by her mother's side. Musicians played cello under the staircase. Laughter echoed against the marble floors. Grace stood near the central fireplace, holding a glass of champagne. She wasn't at the center of attention. She didn't want to be, but everyone knew who had brought this place back to life. A young art student approached her, nervous, fidgeting. "Miss Holloway," she said, "can I ask, how did you do it? How did you take back what was yours without?" She paused, searching for the word without breaking everything. Grace smiled gently. "I didn't need to break it," she said. "I just needed to stop pretending someone else built it." The student nodded, eyes wide, and Grace knew. The seed had been planted again. Later that night, she walked the empty halls alone. The guests had gone. The lights were dimmed. The fireplace burned low. She stopped at the sunflower painting, the one her mother left behind as both gift and truth. She ran her fingers along the frame. This was hers now. Not because she'd won, but because she had endured. Because she'd refused to let a liar define her name, or a thief rewrite her story. She hadn't gotten revenge. She had gotten something better. Return. Redemption. Root. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, the warmth stayed, lit through every room. Summerwell Hill was alive again, and so was she.